And I did a video not that long ago about my 10 favorite engines. And I heard from all sorts of guys that were annoyed that I didn't include the 3406 Cat in that top 10 list. And for me, and I think I explained it on the video, but for me, relying on the truck to make a living and just hating downtime, reliability was a huge thing for anyone that owned a truck, because no matter what, there's always bills coming in. You just got to be running all the time. You can't have a truck that's in the shop. And the 3406 Cats were really good cats, except for the head gasket problems. And they had all sorts of head gasket problems. It was very common. And because of that, they didn't make my reliability list. Now, I heard from Marshall Baldwin, who said he had one that ran 1.2 million miles with no hitches. And, it's nice to know there were engines, 3406Bs out there that did that. But the majority of the guys that I knew that had those engines had head gasket issues, like regularly enough that it was an annoyance anyway. Happily it didn't break them, because Cat was always really good at standing behind the warranty, but still it meant the truck was in the shop, and it meant you couldn't work the truck. So that was why that motor never did make my list.
What is the most reliable diesel engine?
These days, right now, out of the new engines, I'd have to say that the Detroit is winning the race for that. They seem to have the best luck and the least downtime. So I'd say right now, Detroit is winning that race. And I'd say PACCAR is in second place and Cummins is in third. Now, also, I've been reading about, I believe it's the Scania, not to leave the European guys out, that has come out with like a 777 horsepower motor. And I've never driven one of those. I'd love to try it, but apparently this engine is an amazing motor. So you've got to keep that in mind too with those guys over there.
Can you imagine if the system glitches on an icy hill and the engine cracks going downhill? They'll wonder quickly how you were going so fast on such a low horsepower.
Yeah, Jonathan, that's it exactly. That's exactly the type of scenario that I would worry about. And that these electronic motors are not foolproof. They have all sorts of issues. So we can't even master the technology that we've got now in these engines. Like look at the emission systems, for instance. They're still out in left field with that. So can you imagine controlling other parameters of the motors? And it's just more stuff on there that can go wrong. And I have an issue with that, because in the old days, we used to be able to work on our own motors, fix our own motors, and just keep going. These days, you need a shop to work on the engine.
Norm Woods comments, amazed at how many used trucks with Cummins are on the lots and rebuilt between 400,000 and 700,000 K.
Yeah, that's interesting. And are we talking about? I'm sure we're talking about the red motors there, because they're not rebuilding them because they want to. It's because they've had all sorts of issues. And I've had friends with those engines.
Lee Harvey comments, the 3406B love to swallow turbos.
Oh, that's interesting. I didn't remember that, but I believe that. Yeah, and half the time when an engine swallows the turbo, it goes through the motor, and then you're into an in-frame, and that's never pretty. But yeah, that's not a good thing to spit a turbo.
AJ Waters asks, what is meant by in-framing?
In-framing is literally what it sounds like. They leave the motor in the truck, within the frame carriage of the truck, take the hood right off the truck, but the engine is still sitting there, and they rebuild it while it sits between the frame rails, as compared to an out-of-frame build where they literally disconnect the whole engine, lift it out with a crane or whatever, and work on it on a bench. That's the difference, and that's more expensive. The in-frame's generally cheaper to do.
Norm comments, yes, the red motors, only one in the market that they will rebuild more than once.
Huh, yeah, that's interesting. Cummins has made some great engines in its day, like the 350, the big cams series Cummins, really good motors. Not, you could set them up so they produce horsepower, but not a whole lot of horsepower out of the factory. But reliable as all hell. And it's kind of sad to see. But it's not just Cummins that's had this struggle. Most of Cummins' issues are with the emissions stuff and stuff that is affected by the emissions. So it's kind of sad to see Cummins sliding from they were like a number one contender for years. And now they're in my books, they're in number 3 spot.
JR and WV, not sure if it's better now, but the ISX Cummins seem to have a lot of cam issues. I've never had anything newer than an 855, and that's part of the reason why.
Yeah, and that's right, cam issues as well. And it's so bad now that I was watching a YouTube truck salesman, and I think he was out in Colorado the other day, and he was saying that because a lot of the trucks now you can only get with a PACCAR or a Cummins, and the salesman was literally trying to convince potential buyers that the new Cummins had improved from what they had been because their reputation was so sullied. But now he felt better about the Cummins motors as an option. I'm thinking, oh man, that's a statement right there.
Container Guru comments that the Cummins went down after the N14.
Yeah, he's exactly correct. I completely agree with that. I completely agree. And I had N14 motors, and the only reason I got away from them was because my dealer here, my Cummins dealer up here where I live, jerked me around on a warranty claim. And then at the same time, I had the Lettuce King yelling in my ear to get a cat, and that was why I switched, because Cummins let me down on a warranty claim, and Cat had amazing warranty coverage at the time.
Grilled Mortal comments, was not impressed with the 400 Cummins. Yep, cam issues, 1983.
Oh, really? You had an issue in 83 with a cam? The one I had a warranty issue with was an 84, and it pulled down a liner, and I ended up having to pay for that myself when it should have been warranty. And that was where I got into it with Cummins. But for the most part, they were really good.
Danny Peasley comments, what would be more important, engine horsepower or engine torque for pulling loads?
Whoa, really good question. Now, according to the experts, it's torque that gets you up the hill. So I guess the correct answer for that is torque over horsepower.
Jay Holzer, 1989, the new X Series Cummins is much more reliable platform than the older ISX.
Well, that's good to hear, because God knows Cummins needed some help. They had to do some work there. And, I think essentially the block is pretty good, and the internal workings of the motor, but, still, it's got more issues than it should have for a motor that, when you look at the build price of the engine on a truck, that you're paying almost $100,000 just for the motor,
Clayton Wolf, 1983 400 is a big cam 3. Big cam 1 and 2 are better.
Yes, that's yeah. I completely agree with that. That's right.
And someone has asked what engine you have in your Pete.
I've got it's a 2003. It came from the factory. My truck's an 04, but the engine is an 03 that they had from the building the 03s. It's an 03 475 Cat engine, and it's an MBN code motor, which meant it was a bridge motor, and it was Cat's first attempt to meet the emissions regulations that were coming out, and all you had to do to it was take off the catalytic mufflers and disconnect like a recirculating line to the turbo, like a turbo scavenging line, and then you had a 6NZ. But mine's been very good. You can plug it in and dial it up to a 550, or you can turn it down to 475. I left mine at 475, and it's been a great engine.
JR and WV, I agree with the Detroit comments. My 238 in our S model tandem has been the most reliable, best starting engine on most job sites. It's also the slowest at 238 horse, but dies, I don't think he means dies, fine as a site truck. Probably does fine as a site truck.
You know, there's kind of a trade-off. I've talked to engine guys that say, you know, you can put more horsepower into any motor, but you know, it doesn't last as long. If you leave it dialed down, it extends the life of the engine basically, and that's one of the reasons I've left mine at 475 rather than dialing it to 550. And you know, mine's got over like 1.2 million miles on it now, and I've never touched it. So maybe there's something to that.
Z Diggett, is the Detroit 60 12.7 as good as the 14 liter?
That's a really good question. But I'm assuming that you mean the 14 liter Detroit, and I'd have to say yes. I'm just thinking here about reliability issues that I've heard of, but no, I think they're every bit as good. The 12.7 was a great motor, and so are the bigger Detroits like the DD15 and 16.
Container Guru, them old motors could be rebuilt for $4,000 to $7,000 in your driveway and go forever. The new emissions engines, $40,000, can't get them out of a yard without a mechanic.
Yeah, who's Container Guru said that? He's absolutely right. Kathy and I rebuilt our big cam Cummins, the one for the 1984 big cam Cummins. We did an in-frame on it, and that motor was $6,000, and I had the shop do it, and for $6,000. And I talked to Kath the other day about doing an in-frame on mine. There's, you know, it's still running, but I'm thinking, geez, you know, maybe I should put some money into it. And Kat wants $40,000 to in-frame my 475, and I'm thinking, man, you know, but my truck doesn't work, so I'm not going to do that. But what a hell of a price difference for an average owner-operator. That's the difference between being able to afford to rebuild the engine and not being able to afford to rebuild the engine. And that's why all sorts of guys trade up into newer trucks, because they can't afford to fix the other stuff that's out there. Like right now, like if you've got a 2017 with engine trouble, you may be better off just to deal the truck than try to rebuild the damn motor on it.
Jess Sager says the best tractors we run at work are the Mack Anthems. Awesome power, no emissions issues, rated at 505 horse, 1860 torque. They have no issues moving our heavy feed and ingredients loads.
Well, that's good to know. It reminds me of a Lettuce King story. The Lettuce King's dad, no, it wasn't his dad, it was a company the Lettuce King worked for, bought new Macs, and they were cement mixer trucks. So one of these trucks loaded up with a load of cement, and the truck's running, and the barrel on the cement truck has to keep turning, or the cement hardens. Well, this brand new $200,000 cement truck, the engine quit. So the barrel quit turning. And by the time they got to the truck and they couldn't get it up and running, the cement hardened in the barrel, brand new cement truck, and they had to write it off just because the engine quit. Like, holy God, it would have never happened with an old engine. But every time I hear Mack engines, I think of that story now, because it was a Mack cement truck.
Ismael Garcia, Dave, any opinion on the Marmon trucks? I've seen a few out in the wild, and they either had a cat or a big cam Cummins in them.
Marmons were a really good truck in their day. They didn't move down an assembly line. They were hand built in one spot in the factory. And they were kind of reminiscent of the old International Transtar conventionals when you looked at them. They put me in mind of those, but they were just a really well-built truck simply because they didn't move down an assembly line. They were built like right in one spot, and everything was brought to the build. And the older Western Stars, when they were made in Kelowna, were like that as well.
Dylan comments, this is an interesting comment, they don't want owner-operators without a truck payment. Ooh.
Jeez, you don't even want to get me started on that. I'm afraid to think about that. If you're right, and Kathy agrees, that she says, but you know how pathetic is that though? I guess it's all about control. You'd think you'd want your owner-operators to succeed and progress and do well and progressively build their bank accounts.
They want the owner-operator to become needy.
Geez, and
in my opinion.
when you look at owner-operators and lease operators these days, that seems to be the way it's going, and I never thought of that. But isn't that a scary and upsetting thought? Sad. It is.
Robert comments the difference between a Mack and a Volvo was nothing but the name on the hood and the engine block.
Well, certainly now I believe they're both owned by the same company. I don't think they're manufactured in the same plants. And Mack seems to be more of a construction application rather than a highway truck, whereas the Volvo is a highway truck, or built primarily to be a highway truck anyway, and it doesn't seem to do that particularly well. But it's kind of application. When you build a truck, it helps if you get the proper build to match the application. It makes a big difference. So maybe that's part of where Volvo falls down. Maybe they'd be better off, as a vocational truck rather than a highway truck. But my experience is with the highway stuff rather than the vocational.
Jose Lopez, the best one is the Detroit Series 60, 12.7, very reliable.
Yeah, that was an incredibly reliable engine. And that, if you were watching a few weeks ago when we had Marty on talking about the ice road trucking, that was what he had, was the 12.7 Detroit. Working in outrageous conditions, outrageous cold, pulling all sorts of heavy weight. That motor's still running today with a couple million miles on it. You can't argue with that.
And in the ice roads, he never shut it off.
Yeah, and it ran like non-stop. That's right. Exactly.
Grilled Mortal has a comment. They want you always in a new truck, not for safety, but so you will do anything for work. That has been true of trucking companies for decades. I've seen that happening for many decades. That's the truth.
That is the truth. That's right. And that's part of the reason you don't see these carriers, although they're coming around. But it used to be if your truck was older than 5 years and you were an owner-operator, they didn't want you. Well, they're changing that now because they can't get anybody. But yeah, that's right.
Yeah, they didn't want you to have an escape plan. They wanted you to be needy.
Yeah, I worked for a carrier when my one truck was paid for, and they hated that because when I didn't like the load or whatever, I would just go home, and it drove them nuts that I could afford to go home. And that's, so there's something wrong with that.